Imagine Earth more screwed than it is now. Difficult, but very much so not impossible. Now imagine humanity knocked back on its heels by a 1-2 punch from not only a massive shift in global environments, but also a concurrent outbreak of a devastating disease that despite our advanced medical technology, we were not able to combat, as the only thing remaining of human society is a single city with small, more scattered feral outposts across the planet. In the events and book and subsequent movies, Maze Runner, that's exactly what happened to Homo sapiens on our backwater planet. The sun being the giver of life is something we consistently and without fail must rely on to keep everything in working order while we try to figure out things down here. However, should an upset in that relationship happen, there's little that we could do to actually rectify the issue. Throw in a disease that moves through a population resulting in bloodthirsty monsters, then you got yourself a pretty good post-apocalyptic scenario that I'm sure, based on current events, we would overcome, right? Well, even if we don't, it's not going to stop this video from being made. In today's episode, we will discuss what happened to Earth and why this devastating disease was able to get a foothold and bring humanity to its knees. Alright, let's get to it. So we all know the drill by now, but if you're a newbie, then there will be a timestamp up on screen. Heading there, you can bypass a summary of these movies. And oh yes, movies! I am literally covering the entire trilogy. But in the interest of time, and honestly, I'm not really sure who's seen it and who hasn't seen it, I'm doing a much more generalized summary of the movies so that this video isn't like 3 years long. But anyhow, again, going to the timestamp up on screen, you will go directly to the actual discussing of the disease in Maze Runner. But now let's get why the balance between Earth and the sun, it's ever changed in terms of energy received. We are all just mega screwed. But it's best just to not think about how precarious our entire existence hinges on everything staying the exact same way it is in a universe where chaos seems to reign supreme. The year is 2136, and Earth is boned. Out of nowhere, based on how off guard humanity was caught, a raging solar storm would fling a coronal mass ejection at Earth. With no idea this was going to happen and no way to detect it, the world was plunged into strife. The solar flare was so powerful that it scorched the Earth between the tropics of Cancer and Capricorn, turning it into a desert wasteland. All countries within this belt were pretty much obliterated. Within the first 15 minutes of the solar flare striking Earth, 4.5 billion people were lost. The magnetic field of Earth was also disastrously altered, which resulted in more radiation leaking into the planet, destroying more plant life and giving humans and animals caught at these latitudes lethal doses of radiation. On top of this, it would destroy the atmosphere at those areas, resulting in dangerous storms popping up pretty much seemingly at random that would also scour the surface of the Earth. As time went on, large tsunamis, dangerous storms, and radiation would continue to ravage, taking more people out in the process. Those in the latitudes that weren't located between the Capricorn and Cancer were spared the worst of the damages, as the governments that were left would join a supranational post-flare coalition, or PFC, in an effort to establish order. For a time, they were able to come together and quell the issues that were plaguing humanity at this time, or at least ease them, but ultimately, they would make things worse for Homo sapiens. After a 6-month investigation, it was discovered that the surviving 1.4 billion people would overload the planet. Due to the polar caps melting and rising water levels, which completely inundated the remaining land masses, leaving less to go around, and accompanying this with the failed crops, fresh water disappearing, and dwindling resources, they concluded that there was only enough to go around for roughly about 980 million people. Realizing that they had to take out 30% of the population to fix their resource issues, they would go on to create a virus. This virus was originally designed to infect the brain of a person, leading to a quick, painless end. However, someone didn't do their research and the virus would go on to mutate. Dropped in South Carolina first, this virus would be airborne and then quickly move through population areas. Every year, a new infection site would pop up until ultimately it became a global pandemic. Upon this happening, things were completely out of their control. Essentially dooming humanity, 15 years later, people would begin to be born who are actually immune to the virus, having the antibodies necessary to fend it off, either partially by slowing it or fully, in which case they would destroy the virus. This new generation would be captured and placed in trials to study their brain activity and why they were immune. Which, yeah, it does seem like a relatively dumb idea, but hey, ultimately I suppose it would quasi-work. And this drops us into the midst of the first Maze Runner movie. We open up our story with a man that doesn't know his own name. He's in a cage and it's rising fast. After reaching the top at top speed, the cage opens as a group of young men stand around him laughing. He gets out of the cage and immediately begins running off. As he does, he trips and then looks around and finds that there's really nowhere to go. Surrounding him on all sides are massive walls that cannot be scaled. Realizing there is no escaping, he is then captured quickly by the others and placed in a holding cell until he calms down. Eventually, he meets the group's leader, Albie, and the second in command, Newt. Getting the rundown, they walk through the town as he's oriented to his current predicament. Eventually, Eventually, meeting up with Chuck, the village's medic type person, he begins to walk towards the opening in the wall after he spots it. As he begins to question what exactly it is, he is eventually stopped by the enforcer of the group, Gally. As they argue about why he was stopped, the walls begin to close and it was revealed that he was actually just saved because if he had walked in there at night, he would have been trapped and would have been taken out by whatever is beyond the walls at night. Later that night, a celebration is being held with the group. Eventually, Gally then confronts Greenie, as he's known, and continues to call him a shank. He enters the circle and then attacks him, but eventually he is thrown and hits his head really hard. As he does, he remembers his name is Thomas, as the group can finally put a name to his face. Thomas realizes at this point that there really is no escaping the place and then begins helping with the daily chores that the rest of the group are doing. As he does, he is then sent into the wooded portion of the glade. While there, he finds gravestones, but then is attacked by one of the former runners of the group. As he apparently had been stung and infected with the virus, the results of this are that he remembers Thomas and knows what he did, but can't articulate it very well. Eventually, Thomas is able to run out of the forest after fighting him as the group pulls the infected away. They shove him back into the walled area as the door closes, sealing his fate. The next day, Minho and Albie both go into the maze attempting to look for an escape. However, after they were in there the entire day, the group begins amassing at the door to look for them. As they do, they spot Minho dragging Albie, who has been stung and infected. Before the door shuts, Thomas then runs in to help, but gets sealed on the other side, which turns into a whole other set of problems. Basically, being sealed in there at night isn't really a good thing. Creatures known as grievers are released, which immediately begin to hunt them. Thomas is able to raise Albie up and hide him as Minho abandons them. This leads Thomas on a chase with the creature as it corners him many times, but eventually as morning begins to break, the walls shift once more, crushing the griever in the process. As the doors open up the next morning, they come out carrying Albie, with all three of them having survived, but Albie is looking pretty infected at this point. They hold a meeting to discuss Thomas's punishment, with Gally looking pretty upsetty spaghetti, seeing as Thomas broke the rules and now those things could come seeking retribution. As they continue to discuss, another elevator is then sent up, this time with a girl named Teresa. She has a note saying that this will be the last one, which alarms the group as things seem to be changing. Heading back to the maze, they attempt to take apart the griever, finding that part of it is actually mechanical and the other part is flesh. Removing a stinger from its arm, they find a beeping piece of machinery marked 7 on it. Now that Thomas is a runner, Minho then goes on to show him a diorama of the entire maze. They have completely mapped it out before, but then have found no way to actually escape. However, there is a designated area that has 7 on it, which they rightly deduce that the Griever 7 may somehow activate something. After this, they have a whole love interest thing going on, so Thomas then calms down Teresa, but nobody really cares. Then he informs her of where they are, what they're doing, and Gally throws Thomas into a holding cell as part of his punishment, but is really just angry about how the balance may have been disrupted around them. The next day, Minho and Thomas head out to locate Area 7. Taking a piece of the Griever, they end up finding a door and opening it, but are scanned. As they are, however, issues begin to arise all around them. The entire maze starts falling apart, and they barely just escape. Getting back to the glade, they find that the injection that they had gotten has actually worked on Albie's sting, saving his life. However, Albie is now privy to the truth and realizes that the maze isn't really worth leaving, which sort of bums everybody out around them. When night rolls around, the doors aren't shutting anymore, leaving them fearful that they may be completely exposed to the grievers. And exposed to the grievers they are! More doors begin opening up that night, with the main door not closing, resulting in an attack on the glade. Many of the group members are ripped away and ended in the attack before a small number of them are able to barricade themselves in the town hall, which is still overwhelmed. Albie is able to save Chuck and then knock off the stinger of the griever, but ultimately would be pulled out and taken. Thomas says he needs to remember what's happening and then injects himself with a stinger, and ultimately does remember that he used to work for a company that put them all there. Realizing that they need to escape, Thomas then takes his group and Gally keeps his. Thomas then heads into the maze to leave the place finally. While in there, they run across a few grievers and then continue to fight their way through, losing a few in the process, before finally finding a door and opening it. As they follow the green exit sign, they enter the lab and it appears that there was a battle recently. They watch Dr. Page talk about how they are the future and some are immune to the disease and how they weren't able to stop it, but they needed to be tested. As they go to leave, Gally then shows up infected. He takes out Chuck with a force multiplier to the chest, and then Gally gets a spear in his. They leave him to meet his end and then exit the facility, and as they do, a helicopter claiming to be the good guys shows up and takes them away. They fly over a scorched planet to an unknown destination, but we know that destination because that brings us to Maze Runner The Scorched Trials, or as I like to call it, Maze 2 Desert Boogaloo. Thomas is doing what I like to do, fall asleep and pretend I am not flying because flying is horrifying. As he sleeps, he dreams about his mother who seemingly fell after giving him up to soldiers for his safety. And then he has a nightmare about being back in the elevator heading up to the glade. As he wakes up, he finds the helicopter is actually seriously under attack. They have landed at a base with a large group of infected currently besieging the compound. They move inside to the presumed safety, but is it safety? No, it is not. While inside, they are led around by the compound's leader, Jensen. Attempting to assuage their fears, he mentions how they are safe and how they have picked up other groups from other mazes, having rescued them. He then acknowledges that there is another shadow group known as the Wicked, and they have been resisting against them, but his group are not the bad guys. Eventually, they are all placed in a cafeteria with the other groups as Jensen calls out names so that they can be sent to a safe haven. One kid in particular in the corner, however, doesn't look too thrilled about it. Later that night, the kid opens up the vent to Thomas's bed, identifies himself as Eris, and then shows him what's going on. The people who are called are being wheeled out in what appears to be body bags with vital signs on them, showing that they are still alive, but they were never transported to some safe area. Because of this, Thomas begins to become sus about the situation. It's an older meme, but it still checks out. He ends up feigning an attempt to get through the door and pickpockets the guard, showing two things. One, they are trapped there. Two, the guards will fight back with force if you resist. So Ranger McFriendly Jansen and his squad aren't really that nice. Thomas and Eris then work their way through the vents again before finding the group members who were selected. They are unconscious and hooked up to machines. Thomas finds that Teresa is also hooked up to the same machine. As they hide after hearing the doors opening, it is revealed that Jensen is actually working for a very much so alive Dr. Page. She requests the subjects to be harvested for the cure and to make it painless, starting with Thomas's group. Thomas and Eris then run back to warn everyone to escape. So after like a giant massive escape sequence, they eventually are able to make it outside of the compound before they are forced to drink the Kool-Aid and then take off into the desert as a storm whips up. Thomas's group is able to actually elude the search team and then find an old abandoned building completely covered up by the sand. Moving inside, they ooh and ah at the architecture before finding a generator. As they turn it on, however, the horde has been alerted. A huge group of infected who were down there for some unknown amount of time have been stuck. They immediately give chase, running through a door. One of them then gets clawed in the guts, but they are able to pull him out, and then they all hide for long enough until the horde loses interest. However, the next day, things aren't looking so good for Rochacho over here, as he is coughing and in some serious pain. They then move through a destroyed city as they continue to hoof it from the compound and towards some mystery group known as the Right Arm that they have heard about in the mountains. Eventually, though, they are forced to carry the injured, and then they stop to rest and find that he is coughing up black goo and blood. They pull back his shirt to find that his organs are being degraded and the infection is spreading all over his body. Then they do pretty much the worst thing possible and hand him a force multiplier and let him take himself out. I mean, I'm honestly gonna be real here. It doesn't seem like the kind of situation where you should probably let him make that call, but that's just my 2 cents on the matter. As they walk away, they hear a shot ring out, knowing that he has met his end, and then they also left something behind that was probably pretty important for them. But out in the flatlands, they stop for a while to rest as they are all pretty dehydrated and tired. As they do, Thomas wakes up and sees lights in the distance near the mountains. Thinking that it must be the Right Arm, he wakes everyone up, and then they also find that a storm is moving in. Good timing, because that storm isn't like a normal storm due to the damage to the atmosphere. Lightning begins striking all around them as they run, with finally Minho getting struck. They drag him inside the building and into a horrendous smell. They're able to resuscitate him, but as they do, they find chained up infected all over the building. A woman sets out of the shadows named Brenda and asks how they like their guard dogs. They're questioned as to why they are there and then brought through the camp to their leader, a man named George. He wonders why they are there and why they are chasing ghosts in the mountains, but then deduces that they know more than they are letting on. The group is chained upside down and questioned about what they know. Thomas asks why he's worried if the Right Arm are just ghosts. George questions them about where they are coming from and then gets that they worked for Wicked, which wasn't very wicked of them. You know, sort of like how bad is good. Anyways, eventually Teresa is able to swing over and release the mechanism that frees herself, and then she frees the rest, which is apropos timing because Wicked has arrived and besieged this new compound. As fighting happens all over, music plays over the intercom. George sends his people after the group to secure them as they are worth money, but then Brenda ends up saving them. They move into the sewers as the song ends and the compound detonates. Moving through the sewers, they eventually find some material on the walls. Looks very reminiscent of a sort of Last of Us infection, but also find, given enough time, the infected will fuse into the walls into this material after a rat is grabbed by one of the affected and eaten. This ends up activating the almonds of the horde, and then they give chase to the survivors. Eventually, they are able to escape to the surface in a building in a very much so Jurassic Park-esque scene, with standing on breaking glass before then getting back down to the ground. As they move across the city, they eventually run into a giant party, which isn't too far off from how humans would probably treat the end of the world. A man named Blondie makes them drink something before they can pass through. Essentially, he serves as sort of a checkpoint for the Wicked. He will get escaping people hopped up on hallucinogenic drinks, and then the Wicked will come and collect them. Before this can happen though, Teresa finds Thomas and then brings him out of it as George jacks Blondie's truck and and they all head up to the mountains. Upon arriving, things quickly do not go their way. The right arm has found them way before the group was able to find the right arm. However, they quickly realize Eris is actually in the group and then take in Thomas's group, seeing as they aren't a threat. But alas, they are in fact a threat. The group is then brought in and shown around as they are told Wicked has been after them for some time. A former scientist of the Wicked, named Mary, has actually legitimately a cure for the disease and can secure it without taking people's brains out, which is apropos considering Brenda was bitten. She is cured of the virus on the spot from a compound containing Thomas's blood. Mary then goes on to say that the young were lucky and they seemed like their brains could create an enzyme to stop the virus, whereas the older people could not. All while Teresa creepily watches, which I'm sure won't be a problem later, but as it turns out, it's a problem later. Teresa tattletales on the group as the Wicked then arrives. As she stands there asking Thomas not to fight, they start to force multiply the group. A battle breaks out with the right arm eventually being subdued and Mary being terminated in the process. Which, okay, you literally have the person there who knows the cure and you take her out. Like, bro, 2 minutes of conversation could have solved this whole problem, but it's not solved because we need a third movie. In the counterattack, the Wicked is then driven out, but Minho is abducted in the process. Thomas vows to take out Dr. Page as the right arm regroups and they go after Minho, which then brings us into Maze Runner 3, The Death Cure. And what I appreciate about these movies is they basically pick up one after the other. Okay, so I swear, like, I am almost done with these summaries, but this is honestly like 8 hours of movie. I'm just condensing here, so bear with me. I'm trying my best. So we open up the last movie of this trilogy with Thomas's group attempting to track down Minho. A transport is being shipped across the country with many different young adults in chains. Thomas and his group are able to separate the train carts from the front and then begin attempting to get them secured. In the process, they're able to hijack one of the VTOLs and then use it to take the train cart off of its supports. After a brief fight with the Wicked security force, they land the container in a shipping port. Searching the inside, they find, in fact, they did rescue a lot of people, but Minho is not in the container. They accidentally grabbed the wrong cart. Seems like something they should have probably checked prior, honestly. However, at the shipping point, a new idea was hatched. GTFO. The right arm is currently restoring a ship that they will use to completely leave the area and whatever Wicked is doing and find a new place to live far away. Discussing what they should do and if they should go back, it's brought up that even with all the planning they had and the fact that they had the drop on the security forces, they got lucky and it still didn't go completely their way. Later that night, VTOLs are out searching for the resistance, which forces them to shut down the camp for the night and also shows that they're actually relatively close to the Wicked city. Back at the labs, Minho is hallucinating that he's back in the glade and being chased by grievers. In reality, he's just being experimented on to see what makes his brain different, if anything, which is giving Teresa second thoughts about selling out her group. Thomas is not giving up, however, taking Newt and Frypan, they jack a vehicle and then continue towards the city that he may be held in. As they drive through a tunnel, they become surrounded by infected. One in particular seems actually fairly lucid and is able to ask for help. As she does, another starts to attack the car, which then alerts the Horde. They drive through and try to escape, but end up flipping the car by accident. As the Horde moves in, George and Brenda show up and rescue them. And I just gotta say, there's gonna be a lot of like last minute saves in this movie. Heading outside, George mentions that this was the last security checkpoint, so likely the city is overrun. Instead though, they find a huge pristine city with giant walls protecting it. Within the city, the last of Wicked are working to create a cure for the virus, but considering it's mutated, it's becoming more and more difficult to find something that doesn't just slow it down, but actually stops it. Upon entering the city, it would appear as though there's political strife happening between those outside of the walls and those inside. The group is attempting to break in and attack the walls, but are quickly overwhelmed by the cannons outside, which drives them back and away. Thomas and his group are captured by soldiers as a result, and it turns out Gally is still alive, saying that he was left for dead, not dead. He was able to recover from his apparent infection and also a literal gaping chasm in his chest, which definitely pierced his lungs, and I don't know, that kind of seems like it was pretty close to his heart. But anyways, Thomas is actually still incredibly angsty towards him. Needing a way to get into the walls though and rescue Minho, Gally takes them to his boss, to which he can strike up a deal. The man is very clearly infected with the virus, having most of the tissue on the side of his face repatriated and destroyed. Knowing his days are numbered, he seemed to just want to take revenge, but then also utters the phrase, "Don't take unnecessary risks," which that'll be completely the opposite of what he does later. Thomas obliges and then is shown how to get into the walls to look for ways to get into Wicked. Moving through the sewers gives them a way in, but it's still a long walk. In Wicked, Teresa's currently viewing a new compound that she has created to see if it will get rid of the virus. Injecting a little girl who's infected with it shows promising results at first. As she sits and talks with her, she begins feeling better and better. Meanwhile, outside, Thomas's group locates Teresa inside of the building and realizes that she's their only way in. Thomas then protests because, you know, he's lovesick and all that nonsense, whereas the rest of the group understands that they just got straight up betrayed, so why does he care? Ah, love interests. Oh, Newt begins acting aggressive towards Thomas as well, so that's something to note. Hopefully that won't be an issue later, but surprise, surprise, he's infected and his mental abilities begin to degrade over time, with the only thing saving him is his youth, but that only serves to delay the virus. Back in Wicked, Minho is looking rough and then attacks Teresa, grabbing something off the table process. Right after the attack, Teresa is then called back into the medical lab where the girl who was injected is now quickly succumbing to the virus faster than normal, meaning that her injection actually did nothing to help and possibly made it worse. As Teresa leaves work, she ends up seeing Thomas and then gives chase, resulting in her abduction. Inside of the city, Dr. Page is basically ready to give up. The virus has continued to mutate and now has infected the city. The immunes won't be enough to save everyone, so she essentially just says screw it. However, Jansen continues the struggle and then begins to hunt everyone, as now he has really no direction on how to do anything, and he knows he will be infected as the virus is airborne. Back at the compound, Teresa removes Thomas's chip so that they can sneak into the building. She remarks on how Brenda is still alive and how it's not possible for her to still be this healthy if she hasn't gotten a dose of serum in quite some time. She then realizes that there must be a cure, and she pretty much burned all her bridges, so nobody really cares or believes her. Breaking into Wicked with Teresa, they end up freeing all the immune people, escaping on a bus before being picked up by a crane and then dropped outside the walls. Dr. Page recognizes Thomas as he pulls a force multiplier out, but at that moment, Jansen walks by and then opens fire on him. They eventually are able to find Minho while fleeing and rescuing him after he takes out security. Really, they're rescued by Minho, who then takes out security. Anyways, running from the cops, they corner themselves in a room as security tries to break in. When they do, they end up jumping out the window to the water below, which begs the question, they aren't really that far away. Why not just open fire on them below outside of the window? Anyhow, things at this point are getting pretty heated. Galley's boss then rides a truck full of fuel into the wall, detonating himself in the process, which seemed mildly unnecessary, but it gets the job done. It almost seems like possibly, though, it was a unnecessary risk. Anyways, people flood into the walls and a mini war breaks out in the streets. While this is going on, Newt is finally succumbing to his infection. Minho runs ahead to grab the serum to save him, but it is too late. Thomas is forced to fight Newt and ends up stabbing him in the chest, ending him as he became ultra-violent. Running back inside, Thomas confronts Dr. Page, and he is told that his blood is the cure, but before he can take her out, Jansen then shoots her. He tranquilizes Thomas and then brings him upstairs, which, by the way, Jansen literally comes down a hallway. How is this a shock to Thomas? That's a long hallway. Anyways, he takes the serum, and before he can inject himself as he is infected, Teresa knocks him onto the ground momentarily and frees Thomas. However, he gets pretty much right back up and then starts fighting Teresa, but during the fight, Thomas then takes a few shots to his guts. Ouch! Teresa then distracts Jansen long enough for Thomas to throw and break the glass of the infected holding cell, and they escape and then eat Jansen. Escaping to the roof, Teresa is now able to throw Thomas onto the VTOL before the building collapses and she meets her end in the pile of rubble. Honestly, she probably could have made it, but maybe she just straight up deserved that. Anyhow, all the kids escape, humanity is virtually screwed, and then they have to set up shop on an unknown island where they can rebuild society that is immune from the virus, although the planet is still mostly deep fried, so that's gonna probably have some pretty large impacts for centuries to come. Okay, wow, so that was like the longest summary I think I've ever done, but essentially you are caught up now with what this series is. Honestly, it's kind of like the Hunger Games or Divergent, probably. It's definitely on the same playing field as them, but kind of having the added infected made things pretty cool overall. But let's discuss now why humanity's galaxy brain idea to introduce an uncontrollable virus, which we had no counter for, was quite possibly one of the most dumb ideas we've ever had as a species. First things first to know about the virus is its name. Seeing as it seemingly came out of nowhere shortly after the solar flare that wrecked our society, people began calling it the flare, which is a lot better than its actual name, which is what it's known as, virus VC321XB47. Just doesn't have the same ring to it. Upon being released on the unsuspecting populations, this virus was seemingly chosen at random, and as a result, it would mutate and become way more dangerous than what it ever originally was supposed to be. I mean, I get that possibly a lot of scientists were gone and the staff at Wicked looked relatively young, but this line of thinking was so horrendous, there's no way it would have been properly thought out and tested. But the results of this poor planning resulted in a disease that wasn't just aiming to take out 30% of the population to stabilize resources, but likely resulted in a genetic bottleneck for humanity, like the one we had almost like 70,000 years ago, that resulted in only 2,200 humans actually being left on Earth. Oh yeah, we came real close to extinction. Anyhow, the virus originally had horrible intentions, but the process should have not been too bad. Resulting in a quick and painless death, it would eat at the brain, destroying neural tissue in key areas, likely in the medulla oblongata, resulting in your heart stopping and breathing also stopping as well. This would have dropped people quickly before the immune system even had a chance to get into play, resulting in those desired outcomes. However, as we all are now familiar with because of the current stage of the planet we live on, Mutations are quite common amongst viruses. Take something like the flu or common cold, and it mutates over a year. Take things like HIV, and it mutates within literal days of suspension of art therapy. The fact is, viruses, when coming into contact with cells, will adapt to their surroundings like anything else that's alive, despite it not really being, alive. Judging by the fact that this disease is airborne and mutates, the first progenitor characteristic that I would have to assume is that it is an RNA virus. RNA viruses are very mutagenic based on their virulence history, and this is an evolutionary trait that would carry on. Next, while some viruses have seemingly become airborne spontaneously, it's not mega common for this to happen. However, this particular virus at first was much more controlled and likely required touch to be picked up, which means it lingered on surfaces. However, over time, the viruses would adapt to become more airborne, throwing it outside of the realm of control of the PFC. To create a virus that you know for a fact will result in the ending of millions of people, and then not even have a vaccine countermeasure to something of your own design, is so ridiculous that it hurts my brain. This virus would also go on to hurt many other brains of many other people in a variety of ways, so let's talk about disease progression for a moment to explain some of the symptoms that we see within those that are infected. We know when a person is first infected, black veins will begin spreading out past that point of entry, whether it be from a bite, sting, or scratch. Depending on locality and if major organs or blood supplies are in the general area, the disease could progress quicker. In the case of the scratches to the abdomen as well as likely biting concerning Thomas's group member, within a day he was rapidly changing as the virus moved likely into his abdominal aorta and intestinal tract. Here, it would have access to high amounts of blood supply. This is also why we see him throwing up the black goo and blood that we see just under the surface of his skin. Seemingly, the virus attacks the blood vessels of people, damaging them and causing a coagulation of blood to repair those vessels. However, it would appear to be much more adhesive than standard blood clots, as many of these clots breaking loose would cause strokes and heart attacks, leading to the end of the host. That said, as the virus continues spreading up the blood, more blood vessels would become infected and then change in appearance. Eventually, the virus would begin to invade the lungs of the person and then make its way into the brain. By now, the body would know it's under attack and begin releasing countermeasures. At first, this activates the innate immune system, and here white blood cells would try to attack, but likely be infected themselves. However, inflammation would begin first as a way to counter the spreading of the virus. Now, when it enters the lungs, this is the coughing that we see. Not only can you vomit up this black goo and blood, but you're likely also coughing up blood, which is causing a form of pneumonia. Within the brain of a person, it would likely result in meningitis first, which would immediately begin to sort of induce the early symptoms that we know of. These symptoms are changes in personality such as irritability, unprovoked anger, indifference, and depression. Decreased cognitive abilities like difficulty in decision-making, learning new tasks, and loss of short-term memory, as well as problems with balance and involuntary facial movements. These are all calling cards of inflammation in the meninges surrounding the brain. As encephalitis continues to mount, pressure that is put on the brain kind of results in the mind not operating at normal capacity. In some, concerning real life, aggression and depression are on par with reality. After a virus moves past the blood-brain barrier, however, it infects neurons as much as it does with blood. Usually the blood-brain barrier is there to keep pathogens from entering the brain, but viruses are particularly small, which is also how they likely have remained airborne, and this allows them to enter the brain. Once there, neural tissue degradation would start, adding to these problems. Involuntary facial movement would also be activation of the neural pathways and motor neurons as they either burst from viral load or are being stimulated by the virus itself. And the problems with balance would also be these same key neurons in the ears being destroyed, resulting in the mind-body disconnection, as the brain wouldn't really be able to orient itself effectively. And one time I had vertigo, which is basically where your ears aren't reporting where your eyes think that they are. Good God, I've never been that dizzy or nauseous. It sounds like an awful way to go. But the virus doesn't stop there. Eventually your body does one of a few things. Either you are immune, partially immune, either through your own biology or serums being administered, or you are completely screwed and susceptible to the disease like most of humanity is. So let's talk about option 3 real quick, and we will get to those others soon enough. When a person is succumbing to the virus, it can take days for older adults and something like weeks or months for younger people. Essentially, the younger, the better. Well, that actually sounds pretty familiar to present day, doesn't it? As the virus continues to degrade your neural abilities, eventually you begin having this damage mount in the cerebrum. Human cerebrums are responsible for our higher thought and control of our more baser instincts from the lower portions of our brain. With this no longer in check, it will result in stronger symptoms for those reaching advanced stages. Muscle spasms, disorganized or aggressive speech, auditory hallucinations, severe paranoia, dementia, sudden aggression, and self-mutilation are all extremely common. In a lot lot of these can be explained with the idea of schizophrenia. As brain tissue around the ventricles in a schizophrenic brain continue to degrade, this can result in hallucinations, paranoia, speech functionality, or self-mutilation in some cases. Now, take that specific disease and multiply it out to way worse effects as the entire brain becomes degraded, and then we begin to see how this could be a problem. With the brain literally melting in the skull, no part of it appears to be spared in favor of other areas. The virus does not appear to play favorites and instead attacks the entire organ as a whole. However, instincts are kind of hard to terminate as long as the body is still functional and living. Higher thought will begin to degrade until finally they become something known as the gone, which means every ounce of humanity that has really been in them is gone, and whoever that person was originally is no longer there. These people have devolved into cannibals only because of availability. In reality, they will eat anything to keep themselves alive, as seen with the rat. If it moves, it's food. With this, considering humans are around mostly because everywhere else is a freaking desert, then the damages within their brains have made them see humans not as what they once were, and really they're just seen as nutrition. This would indicate that likely these people could be outweighted. After entering their latest stages of infection, they do not appear to keep their bodies intact and instead will sit where they are if no incoming sensory information is given, and this will likely cause them to expire. It may even be possible that they turn to one another, seeing as Jensen was infected, but those who were infected more deeply turned and then ate him. For those who receive the serum or partial immunity due to their age, they will succumb to the disease, but not really as fast as others unless they receive that craptacular serum that Teresa made, in which case they will succumb in hours. As with Galley's boss in the third movie, it's clear he was infected some time ago and likely is beginning to feel the effects as he may not have received a serum in quite some time. Blinded in one eye and his skin is showing signs of advanced infection, this may have caused him to actually ride the truck of doom to end himself when he hit the wall. That, or he just kind of knew his number was up. Either way, it's either bad decision making or really just not caring anymore, which indifference. Speaking of specific symptoms, another thing that you may have noticed is the material on the walls and the skin. Upon someone's infection in the later stages, they will not only have growths in their blood vessels due to damage of this virus, but it would also seem that their skin begins to create growths as well. Likely when the virus invades a cell, some individuals will have their DNA altered to the point that the original cell's purpose changes quite drastically. And this may be why we see almost small biomes being built out of those infected later on. And this can be explained with cancer cells. As I mentioned in my video over the growths in Novosibirsk in Metro Exodus, cells are interesting things. Take a human cell outside of the body and it's extremely hard to keep it alive even if you give it the right temperature and nutrition. Invariably, without the body, the cells will die unless under stringent laboratory requirements, and even then, there's no guarantee. Cancer is different. Henrietta Lacks in 1951 visited a doctor where she was diagnosed with a malignant tumor on her cervix. She ended up passing away that same year, but her cancer cells were harvested, and today we actually owe a lot of medical advancements to those cells. Key here is today. Those cells are still alive and able to grow without the body as their DNA was altered in some way that allowed them to live outside of the body. In summation, cancer doesn't play for team multicellular organism anymore and seemingly desires to exist as a more primitive form of eukaryotic cell and basically be a single-celled organism, but still really has no issue sucking up nutrients from your body because cancer is a biological piece of shit. Sorry, just really hate cancer. Anyhow, this may be what we were seeing with the infected. Considering these almost appear like cancerous growths on the man's face, and on others it almost appears to be stalks coming out of their skin, these may in reality just be tumors. Seeing as these are tumors and likely do not require the body to survive, this could explain the growths on the wall. Notice that it's only in the sewers. Because of this, as gross as it is, likely nutrition is flowing in that water that is usable for those cells. On top of this, as they continue to grow, they would be able to receive moisture from the human environment, which could keep them alive. This may in some ways keep the host alive, as nutrition is almost sent down a pipeline of cells, keeping those cells alive, albeit in a state of barely, and then also keeping the human alive, we really wouldn't call it human. Now, under normal circumstances, we wouldn't have seen this, but based on the idea of cancer cells existing outside of the human sphere of influence, a continuation of a small colony in the sewers may be possible, whereas humans infected on the arid surface would have their cancerous cells still degrade and wither through desiccation. And finally, we get to our are immune people. It's interesting to hypothesize why these people would even be immune. Considering that they do not appear to have a prior infection resulting in antibodies to combat the virus, the idea is postulated that their brains are creating an enzyme that adults just completely lack. As a result, a baby coming into contact with a virus would be more apt to be immune and survive it for longer than somebody, say, in their 40s. But then this raises the question, how long is this person immune for? Only for as long as their brains produce the enzyme, or are they really just screwed as they get older? Well, I believe it's possibly that, but also a combination of your immune system still needing to come into play. The idea of children are not just small adults is paramount to understand this virus. Children, biologically, differ in many ways from adults, so much so that the medicine of pediatrics exists because treating them is completely different than treating adults. For instance, the blood-brain barrier that we enjoy as adults isn't even completely developed in children until about a year of age. So taking medicine for them is completely different and going to have different effects than it does on adults. Not to mention, barriers may be more or even less prevalent in children than adults, meaning that an overdose or underdose is much more likely. So with those who are immune, however, there appears to be a difference amongst them than their peers. Those born around the same time are not just immune forever. While they may have fared better as a child if they caught the disease because of the mystery enzymes in their brain, this doesn't mean as an adult that they are protected. In the case of Newt, as a young adult, while he was able to hold out for longer than, say, a full-grown adult being infected, ultimately he would succumb to this disease. Brenda was saved by Mary's cure, but interestingly, they apparently needed Thomas's blood. In my mind, this is actually a pretty easy one. What I believe is happening is not only are the enzymes of the brain protecting the neural tissue of children, keeping them alive, but also still being confirmed to have been infected. Those who had enough of this enzyme to clear the infection, or at least protect their neurons from being infected, were left with crucial things in their bloodstreams known as antibodies. The trilogy mentions how the enzymes in the brain cannot be replicated and therefore must be harvested, but then why need only immune people? Because the enzymes only serve as a temporary form of resistance. Otherwise, you could just have a baby and then just scoop out the enzymes from his brain, right? Probably not the most ethical thing, but then again, they are putting young teenagers in a maze with monsters, so I don't think ethics really concerns them. Anyhow, as you age, you lose those enzymes as seen with the rest of the young adults who still get infected. Thomas and the others, however, are different because likely they were infected with the virus some time ago, have the enzymes needed to resist, and were able to develop antibodies to the virus. It appears fairly rare though, too. It may take quite a bit of these enzymes to protect the brain enough and render the virus inert, which may be why those kids who were younger didn't do as well as others who were younger and then fell to the virus in the early part of it being released. Some may not have been infected at all, which only gave the young adults a partial resistance to the virus as they had some of the enzymes left considering they were not very old yet. And still some were completely immune, having been inoculated during the portion of their life where they were able to overcome the virus and have an effective immune response to it, giving them the antibodies to this disease. This would be why the vaccines Wicked is testing out are not very effective. Having a fundamental misunderstanding of their own viruses, infection, and immunological response put them on their heels when it mutated, instead deciding to go after the brain enzymes as a cure rather than the antibodies, which I have to say, they couldn't figure that out. Seems like humanity in this timeline is doomed to fail. But anyhow, I want to thank you guys for watching this long video. If you enjoyed, leaving a like would be great, and something is a great way to stay up to date on when I post. I'll drop my Twitter, Discord, Patreon, and Roanoke Tales channel link in the description if anybody's interested in that. I'd also like to thank my patrons real quick. Huge thank you to our 3 astronauts, It's Not a Spoon, Nicholas Goodnow, and Nicole McTavish. Thank you guys. Next, I want to thank our scientists Skilt, DePodge, and Type 3 Screamer, as well as our residents Rock Taco 89, James Wiley, McJizzleberries, Ryan Keen, Sasha AD, Some Red Dude, The Barefoot Lycan, and Travis Ray. And to the rest of my patrons, I thank you as well. Your help goes a long way towards keeping this channel running. Alright, so that's going to do it for me. I appreciate you watching, and I will see y'all in the next one.